Hey Axis and Allies players, this is the Good Captain. Welcome to another video on Axis and Allies Classic, and today we're going to be going over an allied strategy that I did not cover in my Axis and Allies Classic series. This is a strategy that I have had used against me, and it's quite a bit different than the ones I demonstrated in the strategic video series. The reason I've decided to kind of show this to you all is because the two best guys I've played on the forums were AnA and Disneyland, and they both used a version of this strategy. And it's pretty good. At the very least, it threw me for a loop for a while before I could develop any kind of an effective counter strategy. So I'm going to do this as a sort of a part one of a two-part back-to-back YouTube videos series, if you want to call it that, where I'll be really focusing on the Allied strategy in the first part and then the Axis response in the second part. And I feel like the best thing to do is just kind of use as a template my last game against AnA. By the way, consider this a shout out to both AnA and Disneyland. You two were the best, really sharp players that I've ever played, and it was very challenging and really fun to play you both. So if I get anything wrong in here, please comment in the description box below, you guys. AnA, Disneyland. I do want to make sure that I get it right. I'm going to be going over the first turn that was actually played between AnA and I in our last game together. I'm just going to jump right into it as I usually do with Russia's first turn, and on Russia's turn 1, AnA, my opponent, I'll just refer to him as my opponent. My opponent built 8 infantry, and in the non-combat movement, because we're using Russia restricted obviously, he moved his anti-aircraft gun into the Caucasus, left a blocker here, and then consolidated all his units and his builds over here in Karelia. In the east, he abandoned the Soviet Far East and established a 7 infantry wall in Yakut, and retrograded his tank to Novosibirsk. So really there's not too much to say about that. And for Germany's part, I did exactly what I do in my strategic video for Germany with no change. And I'll just sketch it out here for everybody to see. But if you wanted to know the what and the why and the ins and outs about why I'm doing what I'm doing here, please go check out that video. So I'm just gonna move all my pieces in the way that I normally do. Sorry, my computer's a bit slow today. Okay, so we moved the battleship and the transport against the submarine in the eastern Mediterranean, and of course the transport had 2 infantry on it, which were unloaded into Anglo-Egypt-Sudan. The Libyan force goes into Anglo-Egypt-Sudan. Of course the tank blitzing French Equatorial Africa. Both fighters in the East Europe and Ukraine respectively drop down to Anglo-Egypt-Sudan, so we should crush both of these British forces here. As for the Western Mediterranean, we're going to send 1 submarine and 2 fighters against this British battleship. And hopefully at most we're only going to lose that German submarine. And lastly, we move the German fighter against the British transport in the sea zone east of Canada. And that really is it. That's it for combat move. That's all I do. And I'm not going to actually resolve this. What we're going to do is move to another slide here and go to what actually happened in our game, which is fairly common. You're going to win most of these battles. It just depends on what you lose. The most risky battle, in fact, is this battle between the German fighter and the British transport here. There's something like a 33% chance you'll lose that fighter. And we'll go into fractions in a little bit here, but so at the end of Germany's first turn, what I did was I pulled all my forces out of the Ukraine SSR, consolidated in Eastern Europe, set up my Atlantic wall here. I had the fighter return after destroying the British transport, and one fighter return from the German fighter landing in Western Europe as well. But the key here is this German bomber. After it was done with its battle in the Eastern Mediterranean, it moved to Western Europe, and there's a reason for doing it like this that's explained in my video. We'll get to at the end of this video as well. And then down over here in Eastern Europe, or excuse me, Eastern Mediterranean, the British submarine was destroyed, but 33% of the time you're going to lose your German battleship, and unfortunately that's what happened here. However, the British units in Anglo-Egypt, Sudan were both knocked out after the first round of combat and inflicted no casualties, so that's really good for the Germans. Oh, and very important, I evacuated 2 infantry out of Finland, Norway, and dumped them into Eastern Europe. Then I placed my builds, 8 infantry in Germany and 2 in Southern Europe. So this is how we ended up at the end of Germany's turn. On Britain's turn, I'll just go over the builds. Britain purchased an aircraft carrier, a transport, and an infantry. And this is the first telltale sign of this strategy. I call it the unplug and chug strategy. Russia and Germany's turns are very fixed, but Britain is the first power that really the Axis player can see how the Allied player intends to try to win the war. And when he made that purchase, that was the first telltale sign that this is going to be an unplug and chug strategy. So again, this is something I just came up with. It's not eloquent, but it is practical, and you'll see why in just a moment. So an aircraft carrier, transport, and an infantry were purchased, and he saved 1 IPC. For the combat moves, the British moved 2 fighters against the German fleet south of Finland, Norway, a bomber to Anglo-Egypt, Sudan, along with this infantry here. But we're not done yet. And here's where we come up with the unplug portion. We've seen that Britain is investing all of its IPCs on its first turn in builds that are more than likely going to be aimed at Germany as soon as possible. When we see them unplug from India to snuff the Germans in Anglo-Egypt, Sudan, we're pretty confident that the Allies are not only going that they're going for the Germany first strategy, but notice how Britain unplugs from fighting against the Japanese. We're pulling everything back, allowing the Japanese to come on into India, and in exchange, we're going to pound Germany early. So we have 3 infantry, a fighter, and a bomber against 3 infantry and a tank. Now let's move to the next slide. You'll notice nobody's here, and the fighter and the bomber are down in Kenya, Rhodesia. So this battle I'm going to go over real quick. So you had 3 infantry, fighter, and a bomber versus 3 infantry and a tank, right? So when you calculate these odds, the attacker wins 84. I saw 92 in there. So somewhere between 84 and 92% of the time you're going to win. So we're pretty sure we're going to win. This looks like a good attack. Let's look at the average attacker units left. It looks like 2, and if you're lucky, sometimes, not really lucky, but sometimes you'll have 3. That means your air units, your 2 air units are going to survive more likely on this victory. And you might have a ground unit. So as it shook out, both sides' ground armies destroyed each other, and both air units, which only had 1 movement factor left, decided to go to Kenya, Rhodesia, where they met up with the South African infantry for protection, right? And this is the main thing the British needed, was to wipe out the German ground forces so that they can't expand and take over more parts of Africa next turn. The British turn's over, and we move to the Japanese turn. So I just want to say that we've covered the unplug portion of this. Like, why do I call it the unplug and chug? Unplugging Britain from the UK, or from the fighting the Japanese, is the first part of it. When we get to the Americans, you'll start to see the second part. For Japan's move, this is what I did. I sent 1 infantry into the Soviet Far East, 1 infantry into India. I had to leave 1 infantry to guard French Indochina against any Xinjiang infantry units, and everybody else I sent into China, including every air unit that could reach. Okay? And then if you've seen my Japanese strategic video, you know that I consolidate the combined fleet. I still just think this is the optimal move. And I think I can explain a little bit more why I like to do that as we go along through this video. But I don't know if AnA did this on my opponent, I should say did this on purpose, but opening up these 2 territories removes 2 infantry from the attack on China. So I'm always going to leave a blocker in French Indochina, but I had to strip 2 infantry out of this battle, which I don't like to do. The reason is I'd like to kill everything in one. You really want to wipe these American units out in 1 round of combat. If they're allowed a second round, you're almost assured to get another hit, because it'll be the American fighter that does the damage. And Japanese infantry are at such a premium on the first few turns. You really want to preserve as much as you can. And my purchases were 3 transports. And I have to say, a lot of this is operating under the assumption that it's an unplug and chug. I am sort of assuming that my opponent is using this strategy, and one of the counters is, and I'll get into this more in the next video, is that the Axis powers need to grab up, especially Japan. Well, really just Japan. If you see this unfolding, you need to start grabbing up IPCs as fast as you can. So notice that at the end of this turn, we're going to have +7, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So we'll be collecting 32. You want to turn Japan into a powerhouse as fast as possible if you see this strategy unfolding. So, yeah, and then building 3 transports is also sort of a response. You could build 2 transports and 3 infantry, which is a good build, but I built 3 transports because I want a rapid expansion, and it's important to turn Japan into this crazy octopus as fast as you can. So you can see here at the end of my turn, I did end up losing that extra infantry, so I only had 2 left here instead of 3 like I was hoping. We used our 2 transports to dump 4 infantry, 2 from the Philippines, 1 from Okinawa, and 1 from Japan into Manchuria. We consolidated 3 fighters and a bomber in Manchuria. We put 2 fighters on the carrier. That's Japan's turn. And then the final turn is American. And there's really not much to go over here, so I'll just flip it to the next slide. And it's all non-combat movements, but here's the chug. The unplug was the British unplugging from India to go fight the Germans, and the chug, or unplug and chug strategy here, is unplugging from the Pacific and chugging towards Germany via the Panama Canal. You're relocating the fleet, and also the builds, which were 5 infantry, a tank, and 2 transports. So it's very clear that Germany is the target, and he's consolidated his fleet over here by moving the American transport, dumping off 2 infantry in Finland, Norway, and then moving these 2 fighters onto the British aircraft carrier. So yeah, this is definitely what's happening. So now I'm going to talk about projecting into the future turns, because this area of the board is very important to understand. What we're going to do here as the allied player is start shucking equipment via the Canada C-zone east of Canada, pulling up troops off of Western Canada for the most part. So the Americans, you're letting Japan have sort of a free ride through the Pacific, like taking out Australia, New Zealand, Hawaii, and partially through Asia. But you do want to kind of have some kind of a plan, because you don't want the Japanese, for instance, to take the Western U.S. or really any of these territories in the Americas at the beginning. And there's a cheap way of deterring the Japanese from doing that, and that's by putting builds in the Western U.S., which turns Mexico and Western Canada into dead zones, and then moving them the next turn into Western Canada which turns Alaska into a dead zone while you still build new units in the western U.S. So you can see how the entire this four territory section of the board can be protected just by your builds moving into a position where they can be picked up by transports, which can then project their power into Algeria, Western Europe, Germany, or Eastern Europe, all from the sea zone east of Canada. Yeah, a lot of people think this is gamey. Whatever, it's part of the game. Deal with it. I do. As the Axis player, I think it's fine. So in other words, the transports come here, pick up units off of Western Canada, and then invade Western Europe, Eastern Europe, Germany, or Algeria, just depending on whatever looks best. Or they can even dump into Finland, Norway, and shuck out of the UK sea zone, go back to Western Canada, come back and dump into Finland, Norway, or Western Europe. So that's the most safe way of doing it. There's really nothing the Germans can do to stop them, especially after the American fleet arrives. And I know it's really popular for the German Air Force to take out that fleet, but I very strongly believe that that is a misconception. You can do a much better job by just forming up a decent Atlantic wall, especially if you see this strategy unfold. What we're going to do in the next video, what I'm going to try to show you, is how to turn Germany into the best of turtles. We're going to turn Germany into a really tough nut to crack. But as far as what the Allies should be aiming for, at the very least, you want to kick Germany out of Africa and take Ukraine and Finland, Norway, and reduce Germany to these four territories here. And at the very least, that's what you want to do as the Allied player before finally turning and dealing with Japan, or at least containing or pushing Japan back. A moderate goal would be to take one of these three territories around the capital. This almost certainly will create a domino effect where Germans will be hard-pressed to defend their capital. You break down one of these territories and you put a huge crack in the German nut. And ideally, you take down Germany. Ideally, I should say, you take down Germany before Japan becomes a huge problem. Because if you're not careful, it can become a huge problem. So just to recap, this is what I call the unplug and chug strategy. For the Allies, this involves, Russia's pretty standard, but it involves the British and the Americans basically doing the same thing. Move your fleets basically into the Atlantic and build up your transport fleet and start shucking across about 4 or 5 transports worth of equipment every turn into the fight against Germany. Where you want to aim this equipment and material gun is up to you. You can aim it through Finland, Norway to reinforce the Russians and just bash down Eastern Europe. You could, at the very least, you want to send your first few groupings towards Africa to shut it down. Or you could even do the Operation Overlord and invade Western Europe. In a pinch, you can do Husky and try to hit Southern Europe, but this involves you setting up some kind of fleet arrangement here, staging out of Algeria. So this is the Allied side of it, and in my next video I will be going over the Axis response, and I'll be picking up here at the end of round 1. We'll basically be going through round 2, so you can see how the Axis reacts. And I'll stop here and make a kind of a side note in that I'm starting to feel like the Allies do dictate more than the Axis what happens in this game. So for the global players, you know that the Axis are really the ones who kind of control what the Allies are going to do or how they're going to react to your strategy. So the Axis decide to do certain things and the Allies sort of react. Like if you're going to do Sea Lion or Barbarossa or a J1 attack, you know, whatever. But here in this game, I'm starting to really believe that it's the Allied player that is the one that dictates the course of the game. And this is important to understanding because, if I'm right, the Axis player is the one who needs to be aloof and aware. You're not the one who's dictating the course of the game. You might think you are or feel like you are, but I think that it might be a misconception. Again, I'm not 100% sure on it, but the more I play this, the more I realize it's the Axis that sort of has to make the correct responses to the allied strategy. So that's it. I hope to see you in the next video. Again, this is the Unplug and Chug strategy, different from Don Ray's or my strategy. Thank you for watching this. All the best from the good captain, and bye-bye.